The moon was a cold, silver wound in the October sky, bleeding pale light over the hills of Copper Creek. Down below, in that ghostly glow, a man was digging. The sound of his shovel was the only heartbeat in the dead quiet of the night. Metal biting into dirt, over and over, a rhythm of desperation. Jackson Riley felt the strain in his shoulders with every scoop. Sweat cooled on his skin, a stark contrast to the fire burning in his gut. He wasn't digging a grave, not a 6-foot one anyway. He was digging just deep enough to bury a secret. He stopped, leaning on the shovel, his breath pluming in the air like a ghost. From this hilltop, the lights of town were tiny, distant stars. He knew someone was watching. Someone was always watching in Copper Creek. Jackson forced himself back to the task. The hole was ready. He reached for the small wooden box beside him. It was worn smooth from years of being held, of being worried over. It was no bigger than a prayer book, but what it held was a hell of a lot more dangerous. He ran his calloused fingers over the lid one last time, a silent goodbye. Then he placed it gently in the earth. "I'm sorry, Thomas," he whispered, but the wind stole the words right out of his mouth. He filled the hole, tamping the soil down, making it look like it had never been disturbed. He placed a single purple wildflower on the fresh dirt. It was Thomas's favorite, the only sign that something precious, something terrible lay sleeping beneath. As he packed his tools, a light flickered in town. The window of Howard Blackwood's office. The man never slept, not when there was money to be made or secrets to be buried. Jackson buried his own. He always did. Morning sunlight didn't warm Lone Pine Ranch. It just exposed the cracks. The farmhouse stood tired and stubborn, its white paint peeling, a porch sagging like a broken shoulder. The house was a lot like its owner, scarred but still standing. Inside, Jackson sat with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. It had been 7 years. 7 years since the Copper Creek mine collapsed. 7 years since he'd last heard his brother's laugh. Every morning the silence was just as loud. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, the stubble like sandpaper. The nightmares had come again. Smoke. Shouting. And Thomas's voice always calling his name, getting farther and farther away. Jackson's eyes drifted to the window, to the hill where the box was now buried. The last piece of the puzzle, the last link to the truth. A nicker from the barn pulled him back. Domino, his old Appaloosa, was waiting for breakfast. The horse was arthritic and grumpy, but he was loyal. He'd seen Jackson through the worst of it. "All right, old man, I'm coming," Jackson muttered. The routine was his anchor. Feed the horse, check the cattle, fix the fence. Simple tasks with beginnings and ends. Unlike grief, unlike the burning question that had haunted him for 2,555 days. What really happened down in that mine? In the barn, as he poured oats, his mind went to the letter he'd burned yesterday. Another offer from Blackwood Mining to buy his land. The 4th one this year. Each number bigger than the last. He'd never sell. His father built this place. Thomas loved this place. Some things didn't have a price. By midday, he was out on the north pasture, fixing a broken fence post. The ache in his muscles was a welcome distraction from the ache in his soul. That's when Domino's ears shot up. The old horse let out a snort. Someone was coming. Jackson's hand went to the Winchester on his back. In 7 years, he hadn't had a single friendly visitor drop by unannounced. The sound grew clearer. Footsteps. Stumbling, tired footsteps coming up the long dirt road. He took cover behind an old oak, rifle ready but not raised. He'd wait. He'd watch. Around the bend came a sight so strange it made him lower his weapon. A woman. She was wearing a fine blue dress, now torn and caked in mud. Her dark hair was a mess, and a nasty gash on her forehead was crusted with dried blood. She walked with a stubborn determination, but she was swaying on her feet, ready to drop. She saw him and stopped dead. Her eyes, A shocking shade of green widened. "Mr. Riley?" she called out, her voice refined, out of place. "Jackson Riley?" His gut tightened. No one in town used his full name. To them, he was just Riley, the broken man on the hill. "Who's askin'?" he answered, his voice rough as gravel. She took a shaky breath. "My name is Eleanor Winters. My stagecoach, it was attacked. The driver, he didn't make it. I've been walking since dawn." Jackson sized her up. Her story felt thin. Old Jim drove the eastern route, and he never talked about the remote ranches. And her hands. As he got a closer look, he saw them. Small but distinct calluses on her palms. Not the hands of a high society lady. "How do you know my name?" he pressed, not moving an inch to help her. A flicker of frustration crossed her face. "The driver, he mentioned your ranch. Said it was the only shelter for miles." She swayed again, her face pale. "Please, I need help. I can pay." Something was wrong, deeply wrong. But before he could call her out on the lie, her eyes rolled back in her head, and she crumpled to the ground. Jackson swore under his breath and rushed forward. Her pulse was fast but strong. The head wound wasn't deep, but you never knew. He lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected. As he carried this mysterious woman toward the house, he knew one thing for certain. Trouble hadn't just found him. It had walked right up his driveway and collapsed on his doorstep. Eleanor woke up in pieces. The smell of wood smoke, the softness of a quilt, the dull throb in her head. She kept her eyes shut, listening. It was an old habit. Never let them know you're awake until you know where you are. She heard heavy footsteps on a wooden floor. A door opened, then closed. She was alone. She opened her eyes. She was on a sofa in a simple, clean living room. A fire crackled in the hearth. A glass of water sat on a small table. Her torn boots were gone, and her blistered feet were wrapped in clean bandages. Her head was bandaged, too. But her satchel. Where was her satchel? She sat up bolt upright, fighting off a wave of dizziness. The papers in that bag were everything. They were the only reason she was here. The front door opened, and Jackson Riley walked in, his arms full of firewood. He stopped when he saw her. His face was a stone mask. "You should rest," he said, his voice flat. "Those feet won't be taking you anywhere for a while." She studied him now. He was tall, built solid like the oak trees outside. Grief had carved lines into his face that made him look older than he probably was. His eyes were the color of a storm cloud. "My satchel," she said, her voice steady. "Where is it?" "Safe," he replied, not looking at her. He dumped the wood by the fireplace. "I need it," she insisted. He turned then, his gaze pinning her to the sofa. "And I need to know who the hell is in my house. The eastern stage route doesn't go anywhere near here, and those calluses on your hands don't come from pouring tea." He crossed his powerful arms. "So let's try this again. Who are you?" She knew the lie was dead. This man was too sharp, too wounded by the world to be fooled. She needed him, or at least his roof, for now. "My name is Eleanor Winters," she said, holding his gaze. "That much is true, but I wasn't on a stagecoach. I hired a private driver. We were attacked by men on horseback. They weren't robbers. They were looking for me." His expression didn't change, not a flicker. "Why?" She had to give him something, a piece of the truth. "Because I have information. Information that powerful people want to keep buried." She looked down at her bandaged hands. "I can't tell you more. Not yet. I just need a place to hide for a day or two. Then I'll be gone." He stared at her for a long, heavy minute. The silence stretched, thick with suspicion. "3 rules," he said finally. 1, you stay in the guest room, far away from mine. 2, you don't leave this ranch without telling me. And 3, a ghost of a smile touched his lips, but it was cold. "You work for your keep. This is a working ranch, Miss Winters. Can you cook?" She thought of the secret lessons from her family's housekeeper, lessons her father had forbidden. "Yes," she said. "Good," he grunted, turning toward the kitchen. "Work starts tomorrow." He stopped in the doorway. "There's a bath ready upstairs, and some clean clothes on the bed. They belong to my brother. They'll be too big, but they're better than that mess." As he walked away, Eleanor let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She had made it. Step 1 was complete. Now for the hard part. Figuring out if Jackson Riley was the key to unlocking justice, or just another man who would end up burying her secrets, too. That night, Jackson sat on his porch, the whiskey in his glass doing little to warm the cold knot of suspicion in his stomach. Inside, Eleanor Winters was sleeping in Thomas's old room. A room that hadn't been used in 7 years. A room that felt more like a tomb. A woman with city manners and workers' hands. Men hunting her. A story that was full of holes. It all pointed to something bad. Something that was now sleeping under his roof. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. It was yellowed and soft from being opened and closed 1,000 times. In the moonlight, he could just make out the faded lines. It was a piece of a map Thomas had drawn, just weeks before he died. It showed a section of hills north of the mine. A place Thomas was convinced held a fortune in gold. He'd only shown the full map to Jackson once. The rest of it was supposedly lost in the collapse. But 2 months ago, Jackson had found this piece hidden in the barn, tucked inside a metal box with a note. "If anything happens, find the rest. Make it right." He'd been searching ever since. Thomas had been paranoid, convinced Blackwood would steal his discovery, and he was right to be. The collapse that killed him happened just days after he told Jackson about the gold, in a section of the mine he had flagged as unsafe. A report that vanished from the company records. Jackson didn't believe in coincidences. A muffled cry from an upstairs window snapped him out of his thoughts. A nightmare. Eleanor was having a nightmare. He stayed put. It wasn't his problem. Everyone in this valley had ghosts. But then came a second cry, sharper this time, full of real terror. Before he knew what he was doing, he was on his feet, moving back inside, taking the stairs 2 at a time. He paused at her door, listening to her ragged breathing. He knocked softly. "Miss Winters?" No answer. "I'm coming in," he said, and opened the door. She was sitting bolt upright in bed, her eyes wide with a terror that wasn't focused on him, but on something only she could see. "You're safe," he said, his voice low and calm, the way he'd talk to a spooked horse. "You're at Lone Pine Ranch." Her eyes slowly focused on him. "Mr. Riley," she whispered. "I'm sorry." "Don't be," he said, staying by the door. "We all have 'em." Something in his voice made her look at him differently. "Yes," she said softly. "We do." An awkward silence hung in the air. "Try and get some rest," he said, turning to leave. As he started to close the door, he heard her voice, so quiet he almost missed it. They were shooting at him, over and over, so much blood. He paused, his hand on the doorknob. He should just walk away. Her demons weren't his to fight, but the raw horror in her voice reminded him of Thomas after he'd seen his first death in the tunnels. "The first one's the hardest," Jackson said, not turning around. "It doesn't get easier. You just get better at carrying it." "Does it ever stop?" she asked, her voice trembling. "The replaying it in your mind?" He thought of the smoke, the screams, his brother's voice calling his name. "No," he answered, the single word full of 7 years of pain. "But eventually, you remember the other things, too. The before." He closed the door gently and went back downstairs. Sleep was a lost cause now. He stoked the fire and sat in his armchair, opening a book of poetry, Thomas's favorite. He read until the sun came up, the familiar words a poor substitute for the voice he would never hear again. The smell of coffee woke him. Jackson Riley hadn't woken up to the smell of someone else's coffee in 7 years. He walked into the kitchen and found Eleanor at the stove, her hair neatly braided. She was wearing his brother's old clothes, but somehow she made them look like they belonged to her. "Good morning, Mr. Riley," she said, not turning around. "I hope you don't mind. I thought I'd start earning my keep." He just grunted and poured a cup. It was stronger than he made it. Better. "There's fresh bread, too," she added. He raised an eyebrow. Baking bread wasn't a skill he expected. This woman was a walking contradiction. A puzzle he couldn't stop trying to solve. "The animals need feeding," he said. "After breakfast, I'll show you the property." They ate in silence. It was a strange feeling, sharing his table with someone again. It felt less empty. "You're a good cook," he said abruptly. She looked up, surprised. "Thank you. My father never approved. Our housekeeper taught me in secret. She said every person should know how to feed themselves." "Sounds like your father had some rigid ideas." A shadow crossed her face. "He was traditional." The way she said didn't escape him. Another piece of the puzzle. He took her on a tour of the ranch, the 200 acres of rolling pasture and pine-covered hills. He explained the work, the routines, the constant fight against nature and time. She didn't just listen. She asked smart, practical questions. Then they reached the old barn. Leaning against the weathered wood was a piece of equipment he hadn't used in years. Eleanor's eyes widened. "That's a hydraulic rock drill," she said, her voice confident. "Mark V model, if I'm not mistaken. Odd piece of equipment for a cattle rancher." Jackson froze. He turned to face her, all his earlier suspicions roaring back to life. How does a lady from Boston know the exact model of a mining drill? She blinked, caught. I've seen pictures, in books." "Must have been some damn detailed books," he said, his voice low and dangerous. He knew she was lying, and he was getting tired of the games. Inside the barn, dust motes danced in the sunbeams slanting through the walls. On a workbench against the far wall sat a framed photograph. It was him and Thomas, younger, smiling, covered in mine dust. 2 boys who thought they had the world figured out. "Your brother?" Eleanor asked softly. "Yes," Jackson said, his voice tight. "Thomas." She stepped closer, studying the photo with an unnerving intensity. "This was taken at the north entrance of the Copper Creek mine," she said. "July, 1880. I can tell by the support beams." The hairs on the back of Jackson's neck stood up. There was no date on the photo, no sign identifying the entrance. Only a miner, or someone who knew mining inside and out, could know that. "Who are you?" he demanded, turning on her. "And don't you dare feed me another line about books." She met his glare without flinching. "My name is Eleanor Winters. That's the truth. The rest I can't tell you. Not until I know I can trust you." "Trust?" he scoffed. "You show up on my doorstep with a fake story and a head full of knowledge you shouldn't have. Trust works both ways, lady." "We all have a past, Mr. Riley," she shot back. "You've buried yours out here. I'm just trying to unbury mine." She gestured to the photo. "He died in the collapse, didn't he?" "Yes," Jackson said, the word like a stone in his throat, "along with 5 other men." "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice was so full of genuine sympathy it caught him off guard. Losing family, it hollows you out. The way she said it, the deep, personal understanding in her tone. He looked at her again, really looked at her. "Your father," he said, the pieces clicking into place. "He's dead, isn't he? Recently." Her composure finally cracked. Her shoulders slumped. 2 weeks ago," she whispered. "Was it natural?" he asked. A bitter, broken smile touched her lips. "Nothing about his death was natural, Mr. Riley." She changed the subject, turning back to the photo. "You both look so happy there." "We were," he said simply. It was before. Before the collapse, before the silence, before everything fell apart. Later that day, while Eleanor was busy in the kitchen, Jackson slipped into her room. He had to know. He hated himself for it, but he searched her things. Her satchel held clothes and a journal he refused to open. A man had to have some lines he wouldn't cross. But tucked inside the lining of her ruined boots, he found it. A folded piece of paper. A sketch. His blood ran cold. It was a hand-drawn map of the hills around the North Shaft, the same area from his brother's map fragment. But this one had details only a local would know. An old hunter's cabin, a rock formation called Devil's Thumb, and a small, precise X marked on a very specific spot. The exact spot on the hill where he had buried the box just 2 nights ago. He heard her footsteps in the hall and shoved the sketch back into the boot just as she appeared in the doorway. "Dinner is almost ready," she said, her eyes narrowing as she saw him in her room. "Is something wrong?" He stood up, his face a careful mask. "Just checking to see if you needed more blankets." She didn't believe him. He didn't care. His mind was spinning, a hurricane of questions. How did she have this map? Who was she? Who sent her? Just as they reached the bottom of the stairs, a sharp knock echoed through the house. Jackson's hand went for the pistol in the hall table drawer. He motioned for Eleanor to stay back. "Riley, you in there?" a familiar voice called out. "It's Samuel. Got news." He relaxed, just a little, and opened the door. Samuel Martinez, his oldest friend and neighbor, stood on the porch. His weathered face was grim, and his eyes widened when he saw Eleanor. "Didn't know you had company," Samuel said. "This is Eleanor," Jackson said. "She's staying for a bit." Samuel nodded at her, but his eyes shot back to Jackson. "We need to talk. Alone." As Eleanor disappeared into the kitchen, Jackson stepped onto the porch. "What is it?" Samuel leaned in close, his voice a low whisper. Blackwood's men were in town, asking questions about a woman, a dark-haired woman with green eyes. He fixed Jackson with a hard stare. "They're saying she stole some important papers from him." Jackson's face remained a stone. "Papers that could ruin him," Samuel went on, his voice dropping even lower. "And that's not the worst of it, Jackson. They're telling everyone she's dangerous. They're saying she murdered her own father." The smell of rabbit stew filled the kitchen, but Jackson couldn't have eaten a bite if his life depended on it. He walked back inside, Samuel's words echoing in his head. Murdered her own father. Eleanor stood at the stove, calm as a summer morning, a perfect picture of innocence. "Your friend seemed worried," she said, her voice even. "He had some interesting news," Jackson replied, grabbing 2 bowls from the cupboard. "Seems Howard Blackwood is looking for a woman. Dark hair, green eyes." Her hand, holding the ladle, paused for just a fraction of a second, but he saw it. "Is that so?" she said, her voice still perfectly level. "They say she stole some papers," he continued, setting the bowls on the table with a loud clack. "Papers that could ruin a man." He looked her right in the eye. "They also say she killed her father." The ladle fell from her hand, clattering against the stove. She turned to face him, her face pale, but her eyes were blazing with defiance. "And do you believe everything Howard Blackwood says, Mr. Riley?" "I believe you owe me the truth," he shot back. She lifted her chin. "My father was Judge William Winters. He was found dead in his study 2 weeks ago. They called it a suicide." Her voice turned to steel. "It wasn't. I didn't kill him, but I know who did." "Blackwood," Jackson guessed. "He ordered it," she said. She began to serve the stew, her hands shaking slightly. "My father and Howard Blackwood were partners for 20 years, in business and in crime, mining fraud, claim jumping, covering up safety violations." She placed a bowl in front of him. "Including, I believe, the Copper Creek mine collapse." The world seemed to stop. "What do you know about that?" "I know 6 men died," she said, her gaze locking with his. "And I know the official report was a lie. My father signed off on it, but I found his private files. There was a report from one of the miners warning about the support beams in the North Tunnel, a report that Blackwood ordered him to suppress." The name was a ghost on his lips. Thomas. She nodded slowly. Thomas Riley. His warnings were buried, just like he was. She pushed a folded paper across the table. It was a copy, but it was his brother's neat, precise handwriting, and at the bottom, a chilling note from Blackwood himself. Suppress. Too costly. "When I confronted my father with this," she continued, her voice thick with emotion, "he broke down. He promised to make it right, to testify against Blackwood. The next morning, he was dead." Jackson stared at the paper, his hands trembling. It was proof. The proof he had spent 7 years searching for, delivered to his door by a woman accused of murder. "Why come here?" he asked, his voice raw. "Because my father's journal said your brother had found something Blackwood wanted badly enough to kill for." His hand instinctively went to his pocket where the map fragment rested. "What makes you think I have it?" "I don't," she said, "but your ranch was the only place to start looking, for the discovery and for an ally." He pushed his chair back, the untouched stew forgotten. "I need to think." "I understand you don't trust me," she said as he walked to the door. "But ask yourself this. If I was your enemy, why would I bring you the truth you've been looking for?" He paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Maybe the best lies are wrapped in the truth," he said. He looked back at her. "Or maybe you're telling it straight. I haven't decided." He stepped out into the cold night air, his mind a battlefield. Her story fit. It explained everything. But could he trust her? Could he trust anyone? Then he heard it. Soft, sad notes floating from the house, the old piano. It hadn't been played since his mother died. He looked through the window. Eleanor was sitting at the keys, her fingers gliding gracefully. The music was hauntingly beautiful, full of sorrow and a strange, fierce hope. He found himself drawn back inside, watching her from the doorway. She was lost in the music, her face unguarded for the first time. In that moment, she didn't look like a killer. She looked like someone who had lost everything. The music ended. She looked up, startled to see him there. "I'm sorry," she said. "I should have asked." "No," he said, surprising himself. "It's been silent for too long." "Mr. Riley, Jackson," she said, her eyes pleading. "I know you have no reason to believe me, but we want the same thing, justice." He looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, and made a decision. A reckless, dangerous decision. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the map fragment. "Thomas drew this," he said, unfolding it, "the night before he died." Her eyes widened as she looked at the faded lines. She took it from him, her fingers tracing the markings. "This is more than just gold," she whispered. "This indicates a massive deposit. Your brother was brilliant." "How do you know how to read a geological survey?" he asked, the suspicion still nagging at him. "My father insisted I learn his business. He had no sons." A wry smile touched her lips. "He taught me how to spot a lie, on paper and in person." She handed the map back. "With this, and the documents I have, we can destroy him." "We?" he asked. "You haven't thrown me out yet," she said softly. She stood up, ready for bed. As she started up the stairs, he called out, "The music! What was it?" She paused, looking back with a small, sad smile. "Chopin, my mother's favorite." "It was beautiful," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "Even broken things can create beauty. Sometimes, especially broken things." She disappeared up the stairs, leaving him alone with the ghost of a melody and the terrifying feeling that his life had just been changed forever. The next morning, they worked the north fence line together. The chill in the air was nothing compared to the tension between them. But as they replaced posts and mended wire, a grudging respect began to grow. She wasn't afraid of hard work. She was strong in a way that had nothing to do with muscle. During a break, they sat on a fallen log, sharing a canteen of water. "It's beautiful here," she said, looking out at the rugged, lonely landscape. "Hard, but beautiful." "My father always said a hard place builds strong people," Jackson said. "And what about your father?" she asked gently. "He was a hard man. When Thomas died, he just gave up, withered away." Jackson looked down at his hands. "What about yours? You said he was traditional." A shadow crossed her face. "He was controlling. He planned my entire life for me, a proper education, a proper husband. Ambition was not for women." "Yet you learned his business." A small, defiant smile appeared. "I listened at keyholes. I borrowed his books. By the time I was 20, I knew more about his crooked deals than his partners did." He found himself admiring her spirit, her refusal to be broken. That's when they heard it. Hoofbeats. A single rider coming fast. Jackson was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand. "Get behind me!" She didn't argue, but he saw her pick up a heavy hammer. The rider came into view, impeccably dressed, riding a powerful black horse, Howard Blackwood. "Riley!" Blackwood called out, his voice smooth as poison. He reined in his horse, his cold eyes taking in the scene. They flickered to Eleanor, a flash of surprise, then something else. Calculation. "I see you have company." "This is Miss Smith," Jackson lied smoothly. "A hired hand." Blackwood tipped his hat, his smile a razor slash. "A pleasure, Miss Smith. You seem familiar." His gaze lingered on her, sharp and suspicious. "I have one of those faces," she replied, her voice perfectly calm. Blackwood turned back to Jackson. "I've come with a final offer for this land, Riley. 15,000. The railroad needs a spur line. It's a generous offer. Take it." "Not interested," Jackson said flatly. Blackwood's smile tightened. "What's holding you here? Ghosts? Bad memories?" His eyes glinted. "Speaking of which, I've been meaning to talk to you about the accident. Some documents have surfaced. Misleading documents. I'd hate for Thomas's good name to be tarnished by some misguided crusade." The threat was clear. It hung in the air, cold and sharp as a blade. He was threatening to ruin Thomas's memory, to twist the truth. "I'll consider your offer," Jackson said, just to make him leave before he did something he couldn't take back. "Wise," Blackwood said, mounting his horse. He looked at Eleanor one last time. "Miss Smith, I'm certain we've met." "I don't believe so," she said. As he rode away, the silence he left behind was heavy and suffocating. "He knows," Eleanor whispered, her face pale. "He recognized me." "Yes," Jackson agreed. "But he's not sure. Not yet, which means we're running out of time." Her green eyes met his, full of a new, desperate urgency. "We have to find the rest of that map, Jackson. Now." He nodded, his decision made. "I know a place only Thomas and I knew about. We ride tonight." For 7 years, he had carried this burden alone. Now, he had an ally. A mysterious, dangerous woman who was either going to help him find justice or get them both killed. He wasn't sure which was more likely, but as they walked back to the ranch, he knew one thing. The long, quiet war he had been fighting in silence was about to explode. That night, the kitchen table was covered in secrets. Eleanor laid out the copies of her father's private records, letters between him and Blackwood, falsified inspection reports, a 20-year history of corruption written in black ink. "My father was the legal mind," she explained, her voice tight with shame. "He created the paperwork that made all the crimes look legitimate." Her voice broke. "The night before he died, he told me he was going to confess everything. He said he couldn't live with the blood on his hands anymore." Jackson reached across the table and covered her hand with his, a simple gesture of comfort that felt monumental. "We'll make it right," he promised. "For all of them." They prepared in tense silence. Food, ammunition, warm clothes. Jackson handed her a revolver. "Can you shoot?" he asked. She took the gun, her movements practiced and sure as she checked the cylinder. "My father insisted. He said a woman alone needed to be able to protect herself. It seems he was right about something." Just after midnight, they rode out. The moon was a sliver, hiding their movement in a blanket of darkness. They rode north, climbing higher into the hills, the air growing sharp and cold. "It's just ahead," Jackson said, his voice low. They dismounted and tied the horses, continuing on foot over rough, rocky ground. He led her to what looked like a solid wall of rock, but hidden by shadows was a narrow crack, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "Our fortress," he said, lighting a lantern inside. "Thomas and I found this when we were kids." The cave was small and dry. On a natural stone shelf were their boyhood treasures: arrowheads, strange rocks, a rusted spur. "If I were hiding something," Eleanor said, running her hand along the cave wall, "I wouldn't leave it in plain sight." They searched in silence, the lantern throwing their shadows against the ancient stone. It was Eleanor who found it, by accident. She stumbled on a loose rock, and as Jackson reached out to steady her, they both saw it. A small, tin box, hidden beneath the displaced stone. Jackson's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was another folded piece of paper. The rest of the map. "He did it," Jackson whispered, his voice thick with a mix of grief and triumph. "He hid it where he knew only I would ever look." They spread both pieces on the cave floor. Together they formed a complete survey of a massive gold deposit, far richer than anyone could have imagined. On unclaimed land, land anyone could stake. "This is it," Eleanor breathed. "This is why he killed them." And that's when they heard it, the soft clink of metal on rock from outside the cave, the low murmur of voices. They were not alone. Jackson killed the lantern in an instant, plunging them into absolute darkness. He drew his revolver, Eleanor doing the same. They pressed themselves against the far wall, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Footsteps approached. At least 2 men. A beam of light from a powerful lantern cut through the entrance. "Check inside," a voice commanded. A voice that made Jackson's blood turn to ice. Howard Blackwood. "We know you're in there, Riley," another man shouted, his voice echoing in the small space. "Got the girl with you, too. The boss just wants to talk." A hulking figure squeezed through the entrance, lantern in one hand, revolver in the other. It was Lucas Byrne, Blackwood's enforcer. He swept the light across the cave. It was now or never. Jackson knew they were trapped. "That's far enough, Byrne," Jackson called out, stepping from the shadows. He had to draw their attention, give Eleanor a chance. Byrne grinned. "There you are. The boss will be pleased." He yelled back outside. "Found him, Mr. Blackwood. He's alone." The lie hung in the air. Byrne was giving Eleanor a chance to stay hidden. Why? It didn't matter. Jackson played along, walking slowly toward the entrance, his hands raised. Outside, Blackwood stood with 2 other armed thugs. "Riley," he said, his voice dripping with fake pleasantry. "I believe you have something of mine. Some documents. And a young woman." "Never seen her," Jackson lied. "A pity," Blackwood said, his smile vanishing, "because I'm prepared to burn this entire ranch to the ground to find her." He looked past Jackson, toward the dark cave. "And you know what? We'll start right here." The threat was real. The final standoff had arrived. Jackson was outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. But what Blackwood didn't know was that he wasn't the only one who had set a trap that night. From the darkness behind Blackwood, a new voice cut through the tension. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Howard." Everyone spun around. Samuel Martinez was sitting on his horse, a rifle resting across his saddle. And he wasn't alone. Clara Bennett, the general store owner whose husband had died in the collapse, was beside him. And behind them stood Sheriff Patterson and 2 deputies, their shotguns leveled. Blackwood's face contorted in rage. "Patterson, arrest these people." The sheriff spat on the ground. "Not tonight, Howard. See, we've been waiting a long time for you to make a mistake in front of witnesses. Threatening a man on his own property seems about right." "You work for me!" Blackwood snarled. "Not anymore," Clara said, her voice like ice. "The territorial governor has been very interested to read some documents that arrived by telegram last week. It seems Judge Winters sent out some insurance policies before he died." Just then, Eleanor stepped out of the cave, her own revolver held steady. "Hello, Mr. Blackwood," she said. His face turned purple with fury. You've ruined everything." "No," she said calmly. "You did that to yourself 20 years ago." "It's her word against mine," Blackwood blustered. "The word of a patricide." "We have more than her word," Jackson said, his voice ringing with 7 years of anger. "We have the map, Thomas's map, the proof of the gold you killed 6 men to hide." Blackwood's face went white. He knew he was beaten. With a roar of pure animal rage, he lunged for Eleanor, pulling a tiny derringer from his coat. But before he could fire, 2 shots rang out as one. Blackwood staggered back, a look of pure shock on his face. He wasn't looking at Jackson or Eleanor. He was looking at his own enforcer, Lucas Byrne, who stood with a smoking revolver. "Lucas, why?" Blackwood gasped, sinking to his knees. "Killing minors is one thing, boss," Byrne said, his voice flat. "But I draw the line somewhere." Blackwood collapsed, his life bleeding out onto the cold, hard dirt he'd killed for. The long, bloody reign of Howard Blackwood was over. As Sheriff Patterson took a resigned Lucas Byrne into custody, Samuel clapped Jackson on the shoulder. "Smart woman, that Eleanor. She sent word to us yesterday. Knew he'd make his move soon." Jackson looked at Eleanor, 1,000 questions in his eyes. "You used me as bait." "No," she said, her green eyes locking with his. "I trusted you to be the man who would do anything for justice. Was I wrong?" He looked at the scene around him, at the end of a nightmare, at the beginning of something new. "No," he admitted. "You weren't wrong." The long night was finally over, but the surprises weren't. As dawn broke, they returned to the ranch, exhausted but victorious. They were unsaddling the horses in the barn when they heard another rider approaching. It was Samuel's horse, but it wasn't Samuel riding it. A thin, ragged figure was slumped in the saddle. As he tried to dismount, he collapsed. Jackson and Eleanor rushed to help him. They lifted the man's head, and Jackson felt the world fall out from under him. The face was gaunt, scarred, and a trouser leg hung empty below one knee. But the eyes were the same storm gray as his own. "Thomas?" Jackson whispered, the name a prayer, a ghost, a miracle. The man managed a weak, broken smile. "Hello, brother. Been a while." It wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. "But how?" "Blackwood," Thomas rasped, "pulled me from the wreckage, kept me prisoner all these years. He wanted the map." His eyes drifted from Jackson to Eleanor. "Heard you two were causing trouble. Figured you could use some help." He collapsed into unconsciousness. The journey, the reunion, finally too much. Jackson just stood there, staring at the impossible living proof that his brother was home. Eleanor placed a hand on his arm. "I suspected he might have taken prisoners," she whispered, "but I never knew." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "I'm so happy for you, Jackson." He pulled her into his arms, holding on tight, overwhelmed by the sudden, shocking return of everything he thought he'd lost. "You never answered my question," he murmured into her hair. "About staying." She pulled back, a small, beautiful smile on her face. "I think I just found my home, Jackson Riley." He looked from her to the house where his brother was now sleeping safely, and felt 7 years of ice around his heart finally begin to melt. The gold was still in the hills. The trials and the aftermath were still to come. But for the first time in a very long time, the future looked as bright and promising as the morning sun rising over Lone Pine Ranch. The greatest treasure wasn't buried in the ground. It was standing right here in front of him. And some treasures, he was learning, were worth fighting and even dying for. If you enjoyed this story of long-buried secrets and hard-won justice, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss the chilling tales we have coming next. And let us know in the comments. Did you see the final twist coming?